In 1866, the German biologist Ernst Haeckel defined ecology as the study of how living organisms interact with one another and their physical surroundings. By 1935, Arthur Tansley formalized the ecosystem as the functional unit where these complex interactions occur. Every ecosystem functions as a thermodynamic engine, a network specifically structured to operate under the rigid constraints of physical law. This engine consists of two distinct components. There are the abiotic factors, the physical inputs of solar radiation, temperature, and water. Then there are the biotic components, the living producers and consumers that process those inputs. This engine follows one absolute rule. Energy flows through the system in a single direction, entering as sunlight and eventually radiating out as heat. Matter, however, moves through a continuous, closed cycle. To understand biological survival and accurately assess the risk of ecological collapse, we must calculate the hard mathematics of how this engine metabolizes power. This 3D pyramid represents the entry point of all power in an ecosystem, the autotrophs. These green plants and algae form the base layer, capturing raw solar energy to synthesize chemical food. The total solar energy these autotrophs convert into chemical energy is defined as gross primary productivity, or GPP, the total energy intake of the system. However, plants consume a significant portion of that energy for their own survival. This metabolic tax, known as respiration, is deducted from the GPP. The remaining energy, the net primary productivity, is the only portion available to the next trophic level. As herbivores consume plants and carnivores hunt herbivores, the system follows Lindemann's 10% law. At each step up the pyramid, only about 10% of the energy is successfully transferred to the next tier. Roughly 90% of energy is lost at every stage. It dissipates as heat or is expended by the organism's basic life processes, such as movement, digestion, and maintaining body temperature. While pyramids of numbers or biomass can vary in shape, the laws of thermodynamics dictate that the pyramid of energy is universally and absolutely upright. Energy is depleted at every jump. Contrast this with the pyramid of numbers, which can invert. A single massive oak tree acts as a single producer at the base, yet it can support thousands of individual insect consumers. But energy cannot be cheated. By the fourth or fifth trophic jump, thermodynamic entropy has drained so much power that the system can no longer support another level. This is why apex predators are inherently rare. If energy is constantly bleeding out of the system as heat, we face a problem. How does the ecosystem maintain its physical building blocks without exhausting its supply of matter? The solution is the detritus food chain. This loop is powered by detritivores and saprophytes, such as fungi and bacteria, which feed specifically on dead organic material. The cycle begins with fragmentation, where detritivores break waste into smaller pieces. This is followed by leaching, as water dissolves soluble nutrients and carries them into the soil profile. Chemical breakdown occurs through catabolism, using fungal and bacterial enzymes to produce nutrient-rich humus. Finally, mineralization releases inorganic nutrients back into the soil, where they are reabsorbed by plant roots to restart the cycle. While this recycling loop is efficient at processing organic waste, it is incapable of filtering out synthetic human toxins. If an organism ingests heavy metals or synthetic pesticides it cannot excrete, those toxins build up in its tissues over its lifespan. This is bioaccumulation. Biomagnification occurs as those toxins move up the pyramid. Because a predator must consume many contaminated prey to meet its energy needs, the concentration of the toxin increases exponentially at each higher trophic level. The self-sustaining ability of an ecosystem to cycle its own matter becomes a fatal liability when synthetic chemicals enter the loop, turning localized pollution into a systemic death sentence for apex predators. How do these complex engines reboot after total annihilation? This is the process of ecological succession. Primary succession begins on surfaces with no existing soil, such as bare volcanic rock. Lichen, the pioneer species, arrives first to chemically weather the stone, creating the first millimeter of soil over centuries. These pioneers alter the abiotic environment, allowing mosses, grasses, and eventually a stable climax community to establish itself. Secondary succession, occurring after a fire or flood, is much faster. Because the soil and nutrient bank are already present, the ecosystem skips the centuries required for rock weathering. Beyond development over time, we must consider how ecosystems meet in space. The transitional area where two different climax communities meet is called an ecotone. This overlap creates the edge effect. Because the ecotone contains resources from both neighboring systems, it typically supports a significantly higher species density and biodiversity than either system alone. Nature is in a constant state of expansion and repair, blending at its borders to maximize biological efficiency. Human disruption often targets the material cycle directly. In agricultural runoff, excess nitrogen and phosphorus flow into local waterways. This causes eutrophication, where an explosive algal bloom creates a physical barrier across the water's surface. This bloom blocks the solar influx, killing submerged plants. Decomposition then drains the water of oxygen, a state called hypoxia. The resulting spike in biological oxygen demand causes the local system to collapse. To counter these systemic threats, nations develop legal frameworks, such as India's Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. The Act uses strict schedules to categorize species. Schedule 1 species, such as the one-horned rhinoceros, receive absolute protection, legally insulating consumers from human interference. Conservation also utilizes spatial zoning, such as the Biosphere Reserve model, separating human activity from biological baselines. The core zone is an absolute lockdown for biodiversity. The buffer zone permits regulated research, while the transition zone allows sustainable human use in farming. Conservation policy acts as a form of biological triage. It uses spatial zoning to physically insulate thermodynamic engines from human economic pressure. At the geopolitical level, ecological cycles do not respect national borders. Global air and water currents ensure that localized disruptions have planetary consequences. The theoretical risks of biomagnification became a tragic reality at Minamata Bay. The 2013 Minamata Convention now binds the international community to restrict mercury, reflecting the scientific fact that toxins cycle globally. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio recognized that systemic biological failure required a new geopolitical strategy, spawning Agenda 21 and the push for sustainable development. The Montreal Protocol of 1987 represents a legal defense for our abiotic solar shield, phasing out synthetic CFCs to stabilize the ozone layer. The Paris Agreement of 2015 attempts to stabilize the baseline thermal constraints of the planet, acknowledging that every biological process is bound by temperature. Environmental laws, international treaties, and zoning protocols serve as the engineering blueprints of applied ecology, deliberate maintenance patches required to keep Earth's thermodynamic engine running.